Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast about disasters, catastrophes, and epic failure analysis. Today I will answer listener questions, and at the end of the podcast, announce the next 5 episodes. We have now made it to 20 episodes in just 2 years. I have to say I was expecting to get a few more episodes out over that period of time, but it is all about quality over quantity, right? Our first question comes from listener MJ. I'm interested in what you called the alcoholics concept of a geographical. What does it actually mean for alcoholics to do a geographical? Well, for an answer to that question, I went to the website alcoholrehab.com. They describe a geographical as a decision made by an alcoholic or other addict to escape their substance abuse problems by changing physical locations. Basically, the feeling on the part of the substance abuser is that a move represents a new start and a promise of hope that this time things will be different. New friends will be made, a new job will be found, old relationships will dissolve, and new better ones will form and that life will get better. The problem, as Alcohol Rehab explains it, is that the substance abuser is not confronting the cause of their distress, the substance abuse. Often they're running away from their family and friends who can help them the most to face a future where the people who care about them and want to help them with their addiction are far away. Pulling a geographical means to run away from your problems, rather than confront those problems and overcome them. Jim Jones had many substance abuse problems, including alcohol and prescription drugs, but his biggest problem may have been megalomania, or the feeding of his own giant ego. When his ego felt threatened, or his cultic empire felt threatened, Jones picked up everything and everyone and moved to a new location. He moved to Indiana, then to Ukiah, next to San Francisco, and finally to a community of his own making in Guyana. When he finally ran out of physical places to run away to, his only option remaining to preserve his own ego was to destroy himself and everyone associated with his cult. Mass suicide is the ultimate ego trip. From listener BL, there have been a lot of horrible blizzards in Canada and the United States. Why didn't you devote an episode to one of those blizzards instead of to Iran? Well, BL, you're right. There have been a lot of bad blizzards in North America. The children's blizzard of 1888 in the Great Plains was particularly bad because it set in so quickly and caught so many people, particularly children, unprepared. The blizzard in Iran really piqued my interest because Iran seemed like an unlikely place for the world's worst blizzard, but it kind of makes sense because as the location for the most fatal blizzard, Iran is probably not a country prepared for big blizzards. I would have really liked to have known what happened during that blizzard. What did it look like to see the sky completely white out from heavy snowfall? How did the communities get isolated so quickly? Personal stories about getting snowed in and the rescue efforts that were made. I think there must have been some great stories out there waiting to be told by the survivors of the Iran blizzard, and I hope someday that I'll be able to read those. From listener TG, are you going to devote an episode to Hurricane Katrina? I could see doing a future episode about Hurricane Katrina. It was a horrible tragedy that killed a great number of people, and it ruined an amazing city that is still attempting to recover. Katrina includes a lot of important lessons about what to do and what not to do when preparing for a hurricane, as well as what to do after the hurricane strikes. I try not to focus too often on the United States in this podcast. I probably have more episodes that involve the United States than any other country. As it is the media-saturated nation that I reside in, it is easy to find information regarding just about any large-scale disaster that happened here. I found plenty of information about the Peshtigo fire, but I'm not sure I would have found the same quantity of information if that fire had taken place in a smaller nation with less media coverage. But I do strive for some variety in episode topics, different countries, different eras. The trick is that events that occurred further back in time usually have fewer sources of information, and perhaps that's because information is a way of getting lost over the years. The other problem is finding unbiased sources. As you get away from the age of mass media and democratic societies, You move closer to the age of historians and chroniclers attempting to portray people and events in a certain favorable light. Disasters that occurred in smaller nations can also be more difficult to research. There has to be sufficient interest in the event to get an English-speaking author to write about it or the right person to translate books written in the language of those countries. Since I like variety and I like challenges, I will keep trying to find episodes that take place in different places and different times. From listener SK, the number of people who died as a result of the bubonic plague is just unbelievable. You stated as many as 1 in 3 Europeans. There were just so many mistakes that were made because people were so ignorant at that time about how diseases spread. The Spanish flu also killed a huge number of people right after World War I, maybe even more than the bubonic plague. Do you think we could have another plague that kills hundreds of millions of people today? Well, yes, I do. After researching the episode on the Black Death, I was impressed with how resourceful bacteria and viruses are. They are constantly producing and constantly mutating, always looking for an avenue to spread through the human population. Germs have time and numbers on their side. A bacillus like Yersinia pestis doesn't really ever get completely wiped out. They just subside, bide their time, and look for new opportunities to strike human and animal populations. Our scientific community is extremely intelligent, but they can't solve every problem. Right now, the world population is reducing the effectiveness of antibiotics and their ability to kill infections. Overuse, overprescribing, and patients not following the usage directions are reasons that these powerful drugs are losing their effectiveness and creating an opportunity for drug-resistant diseases. Disease is still a major killer in the world, and microbes keep evolving, sometimes faster than we can keep up. One lesson from the Black Death was to separate the infected from the uninfected. But it was also important to have a centralized authority with the power to make decisions that may have imperiled personal liberty in order to save lives. Milan turned out to be a relatively healthy island in a sea of sickness during the bubonic plague because they took active measures to isolate the illness. Pretty remarkable for a 14th century Europe. From a listener in Great Britain, how did 12,000 people die in the middle of London in the 1950s without more people noticing? You must be referring to the Great London Smog. It had to do with the way that they died, which was slowly and over a period of time such as days and weeks. Also, many of the people who died passed away outside of the public eye. They died in hospitals and clinics or in the privacy of their own homes. There just weren't that many people dropping in the streets, and if there were, the smog may have made it difficult to see them. Smog that thick must have had a very isolating effect. One day you're used to seeing a large, tall city with buildings, streets, and people everywhere. The next day you only see a few feet in front of you. The buildings vanish, the streets go only a short distance before disappearing into the muck, and you don't see crowds of people until they're right in front of you. It must have been incredibly disorienting. Also, because the deaths and numerous illnesses and injuries happened far apart, Londoners didn't have a very good idea about how broad the scope of the event was until the numbers started coming in weeks after the smog cleared. Now, even 60 years later, we still don't have a way to clear smog out once it settles in. We can only advise people to stay indoors and not light fires. But the proper measures were taken by London and the United Kingdom in the years that followed. You switch homes over to cleaner fuels for heating, regulate polluting industries, and you move those industries that do pollute away from high population centers. Disasters like the London smog event can be mitigated if not prevented outright. From listener NS, I really enjoyed the episode about Mount Pelée. It took the listener step by step through all the events leading up to the eruption of the volcano. Can you do that with other episodes? Well, that really depends on the documentation of the event. For the Mount Pelée episode, there were several personal accounts of the events. The lead scientist on Martinique kept a daily diary. There were also newspaper accounts and government documents. The Mount Pelee eruption was documented by several sources, from the first signs of rumbling to the eruption that buried the town. There were also numerous photographs taken during and after the event. The episode about Elizabeth Bathory, the serial killer, was a bit more difficult. Many of the accounts were written by her political enemies. Some of the accounts came from her assistants, who were undoubtedly influenced by the court of inquiry to present just one side of the story. Over time, she developed many enemies, and they were the ones who survived to tell us about her story. Finding motivations for her actions was even more difficult, as police investigations were pretty much unheard of for that time, and the aristocratic classes would have feared what an investigation might have revealed about the lifestyles of the aristocracy. From a listener in the Netherlands, what is the safest country in the world to live in? For my money, I'd go with Switzerland. The biggest hazards there are flooding and avalanches, and the Swiss are well prepared for both of those. You really don't hear of many disasters happening in Switzerland. They did have a fire in one of their tunnels a few years back, the Gotthard Alpine Road Tunnel, but probably fewer people died in that disaster than in the average American mass shooting. It's a wealthy country that doesn't get hurricanes, doesn't get many earthquakes, forest fires, or anything that even remotely resembles a domestic disturbance. Also, there's no coast. It's a landlocked country, so that popular avenue for disaster is completely blocked. Just remember what Orson Welles' character, Harry Lime, said in the film The Third Man. After all, it's not that awful. You know what the fellow said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, they had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. It's an interesting question. Is greatness a product of difficult circumstances? From listener TB, who are your favorite authors? Well, like a true history nerd, I would put Joseph Conrad up there as one of my favorite fiction writers, because so many of his stories took place during his time. Then that's the Victorian era, and it was a pretty amazing time to witness history. Conrad wrote about the difficulties people from imperial nations faced interacting with the people they colonized. A lot of our present issues can be traced back to those years of colonization. For history, my favorite pair of authors are Will and Ariel Durant. They wrote an exhaustive history of the world that took the two of them more than 40 years to write. And if you have the complete set, it takes up the whole top shelf of your bookcase. The series ended with the life of Napoleon, and that was only because by the time that book was published, they were both nearing the ends of their own lives. Their analysis and descriptions are really sharp. Both of them provide good insight into the times they talk about, which is a rare talent.
The other writer I would recommend is Antony Beevor.
One example, writing about the result of the 7 Years' War for the common person,
other 20th
Will
century
Durant
conflicts.
said that thousands died for the privilege of determining who would collect their taxes. I read his books on the Siege of Leningrad, the Fall of Berlin, the Spanish Civil War, and the D-Day invasion of Normandy. His writing style is excellent. He mixes personal narratives with a well-paced explanation of events that never lags. And I'm telling you, lice, they're horrible, and they just can't seem to be avoided during wartime. If you really want an understanding of all the different factions that were involved in the fighting of the Spanish Civil War, I definitely recommend his book on the subject. From an unnamed listener in California, what did the Muslims ever accomplish? Well, here's a brief summary of their accomplishments during the height of their cultural and military dominance. The invention of algebra, algorithms, and calculus. The modernization of the 10-digit number system, because do you really want to count in Latin? A treatment for smallpox. The use of alcohol as an antiseptic. A treatment for meningitis. The completion of the first observatory. a detailed explanation of why rainbows occur, a description of the human blood circulatory system, an early computing machine in the 15th century, the early use of anesthesia, optics and ophthalmology, the origins of pediatric medicine, distillation, filtration, crystallization, evaporation, and other chemical processes, the origins of our modern pharmaceutical industry, the minaret, the Moorish style, and many other examples of grand architecture, the translation of numerous classic works from antiquity, hospitals, medical academies, and some of the world's oldest universities, including Al-Azhar, dating back to the 10th century, the development of the scientific method, one of the earliest theories on natural selection, immense contributions to poetry and literature, including the tale of 1001 Nights, and of course an organized religion with over 1.6 billion adherents, or about 1/4 of the world's population. Many scholars attribute this sudden flowering of discovery to the establishment of the House of Wisdom by Caliph Harun al-Rashid in the 8th century. The House of Wisdom encouraged the translation of popular texts from other cultures and promoted learning in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, alchemy, chemistry, zoology, geography, and cartography. The House of Wisdom was destroyed when the Mongols sacked the city of Baghdad in 1258, which, by the way, would make an outstanding episode. However, for Western civilization, their greatest contribution was effectively ending the Dark Ages and clearing the way for the Renaissance. If it wasn't for the cultural exchange that resulted from the Crusades and the Reconquista, I might be reading this text from a papyrus scroll and shouting at you from the center of the public square. Speaking of the miracles of podcasting, I'm pleased to announce the next 5 episodes. Episode 21 will explore 2 stampedes in Great Britain, the Victory Hall Stampede in the 19th century and the Hillsborough Stadium Stampede in 1989. Episode 22 will take a look at the Assassins, a secretive cult that was based in the mountains of Iran, who carried out numerous assassinations of key political figures and in fact gave us the name Assassin. You may not master all the words of Assassin's Creed after listening to this episode, but you will at least be better informed. Episode 23 will take a look at 2 huge theater fires, the Vienna Ring Theater Fire, which took place in Austria in 1881, and the Iroquois Theater Fire, which took place in Chicago in 1903. Episode 24 will cover the Air India bombing of 1985, an important event in Indian and Canadian history, and one of the worst airplane attacks until 9/11. In episode 25, we will examine the great Stalinist purges that took place in the 1930 Soviet Union. Enormous numbers of people were tortured and killed, and the officer ranks of the Soviet army were depleted just prior to the outbreak of World War II. What was Joseph Stalin thinking? I'd like to thank you for hanging in there and listening to the podcast. I appreciate you sharing part of your day with me. If you're interested in podcasts about history, then check out the site historypodcasters.com. There are plenty of great podcasts all about history. And if you know any other good podcasts about disasters and catastrophes, please let me know. I look forward to telling you about British stampedes. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.